On today's Exploring History podcast, we'll continue looking at what it meant to grow up in America in a small town in the 1950s and 1960s by getting a different perspective on the topic.
Welcome to Exploring History with Ray Notgrass, a production of Notgrass History.
I've invited a special guest to take part in the podcast today, someone who shares a different perspective on growing up in the 1950s and 1960s. And that person is my wife, Charlene Notgrass. Thank you for being with us today.
I'm excited, Ray. Thanks for having me.
You grew up in a different small town than I did in Tennessee. We grew up maybe 70 miles apart, but we didn't know each other until we were in college. And although they were both in small towns, yours was a different experience. When we talk about a certain period of time in history, we need to remember that not everybody in that time period had exactly the same experience. And so we want to talk about Charlene's experience and how it was different from mine and just what it was like for her. So tell us about what it meant for you growing up in a small town.
I loved my small town experience growing up in Tennessee. I was closer to Nashville than you were, and so had a lot of experience in a big city in addition to my small town experience. But I am very grateful for a childhood that eventually was in the little town of Ashland City, where I could stand in my front yard and see my church across the street, stand in my side yard and see the elementary school, and stand in my backyard and see my grandfather's grocery store, where my daddy worked 6 days a week.
My dad was in World War II. Your dad also had a military experience. Tell us about that.
Daddy was drafted during the Korean War, which, of course, happened just a few years after the end of World War II. I am very grateful that Daddy didn't have to go overseas like your daddy did. But Daddy spent his time at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, and also in Baltimore, Maryland. That experience was only for 1 year. He got out of the Army. He was honorably discharged in November of 1953. I was born in Springfield, Tennessee, the hometown of my mother, which is only 20 miles from Ashland City, where I spent by far most of my childhood.
Now, you did have an uncle who was involved in the Korean War. Tell us about him.
I did. My mother's sister, Nan, who was younger than her by 2 years, was married to a man who served as a flight controller in Korea. He had the frightening job of telling pilots how to land in the dark at night so that the enemies wouldn't shoot them down. So that was quite a feat and quite a responsibility.
Now, I was a town boy in Columbia, but you had a more rural experience. Tell us about that.
As I said, I was born in Springfield, where my mother's family lived, and we spent the first 6 weeks of my life at the home of my mother's mother and daddy. And then when I was 6 weeks old, we moved to the country next door to my dad's mom and dad. We lived in a tiny 3-room house with a high front porch that I remember because of, as just a toddler, running to the very edge of it and almost falling off and scaring the grown-ups to death. But that house had no plumbing. It did have electricity. We had no indoor water. There was a cistern in the backyard with a pump. There was an outhouse in the back. And we lived there until I was almost 4 years old. We moved to the little town of Ashland City, 7 miles away, in October before I turned 4 in December.
It might be hard for people to realize that people lived without indoor plumbing near a large town in the early 50s. But that was the case for you and for a lot of people in Tennessee.
Yes, when we were living in the country, we were only about 20 miles from Nashville. We went to a little church that also had no indoor plumbing, but it had a cemetery beside it where many of my relatives and ancestors are buried.
So you had a lot of anchors for you as you were growing up.
I was surrounded by relatives. Very near our home in the country was my great-great Aunt Lizzie's house. It was wonderful for me to grow up with so many elderly people around me. My parents were very good about going to visit them, and my grandmother, my daddy's mother, who lived next door to us, as I said, when we lived in the country, also took me to visit elderly relatives. It's in my memory, I remember going to see Aunt Lizzie with her. I have a very special memory of being at Aunt Lizzie's house. I was there at night on October 31st in 1956, not long before I turned 3 years old, and my daddy took me there to go trick-or-treating. And Aunt Lizzie lived there with her 2 unmarried children, a man and a woman, and one of them gave me my treat for trick-or-treating. They gave me an apple. And when we left Aunt Lizzie's and went back home, my mother was, as we say in the South, fit to be tied because she was very pregnant with my little brother, and she needed my daddy to be there right then because it was time for him to drive her to Ashland City. I'm sure he borrowed his mom and dad's, either their car or their truck, because we didn't have any kind of vehicle of our own. And he drove her to Ashland City. I'm sure I went to my grandparents' house, and my little brother was born that night.
I was the younger of 2 children. You are the older of 2 children. Any perspectives on that different arrangement, on how that worked out for you?
Well, I'm definitely an older child. The oldest. I have those characteristics of knowing how to be in charge and too often wanting to be in charge, as my little brother would tell you. But we had such a good time. We moved, as I said, to Ashland City when he was almost 1 and I was almost 4. And we moved into another old house. It did have indoor plumbing, but the only heat, it was actually divided into a duplex, and we lived on the larger side. There was a precious, what I thought of as a little old lady who lived on the other side. We adored Mrs. Perry. I actually got my grandma name from Mrs. Perry. Her grandchildren called her Little Mama. So when I grew up and thought about becoming a grandmother myself, I always wanted my grandchildren to call me Little Mama too. Our oldest granddaughter, Clara, fixed that though. She called me little, and that has stuck. So now I'm Little, but it is in tribute to Mrs. Perry, who was Little Mama but our only heat was a coal burning stove that was centrally located in the living room. One of the stories that I heard as a child was about the horrible day when Mother accidentally threw $1 into the coal stove instead of the piece of trash paper she wanted to put into the stove. But Steve and I were very close. We used to play the record player. We had Daddy was a big music fan, country music fan, and he had several record albums. But Steve and I only remember one record that was our very own when we were very young, and it had the bunny hop on one side and the Mexican hat dance on the other. And my sweet little brother used to dance with me. We would do the bunny hop and we would do the Mexican hat dance, just totally making it up as we went. But we had fun that way. And we used to play Monopoly. I don't remember us ever finishing a game, but we did play Monopoly fairly often. And as I grew older and he grew older, I would be his nurse while he and his buddies were playing Army. We had a sandbox in the backyard, and I made mud pies. It was a wonderful childhood.
When you moved to Ashland City, you moved into a house that was behind your grandfather's grocery store. That was a family business. What was it like to live behind the store?
Well, it was wonderful. I'd like to say something about that house. The house actually faced Main Street, I'm told, at one time. But before my grandfather built his little grocery store there, I don't know if he had this done or if it had already been done, but the house that I lived in, that we moved into when I was almost 4, had been on Main Street, and it had been turned around and rolled on logs pull a log out of the back and put it in the front, push it forward a little bit, pull out another log, move it to the other side and push it a little bit, and moved back to Vine Street. But from that house, I could just walk across the backyard and the parking lot into the back door of Daddy Leland's grocery store. It was called Boyd's Market. And find my daddy putting cans of green beans and corn and cranberry sauce on the shelves, or that's what he was doing most of the time. Sometimes he was checking out groceries at the cash register. Sometimes he was on the phone taking an order from some lady who lived in town, and sometimes I would hop in Daddy Leland's truck with him, and we would drive to one of these little old ladies' houses, and Daddy just loved to tease. They loved to see him coming, and I was blessed to get to go and see how beloved he was by people in our town. Now, a lot of people get their groceries delivered, but there was most of my life that wasn't true. It was true when I was a child. It was not true in most of my adulthood until just the last few years. But I have very special memories of just picturing Daddy standing at the wall phone next to Daddy Leland's office and taking down the order from some little old lady. Then he'd grab a buggy and go through the store and get just what she wanted and deliver it to her. And it was really special when I got to be in the passenger seat beside him. Another thing that was really special was that when I started to school at 5 years old, I would leave the house after Mother fixed us a great breakfast and walk across the backyard, walk across the parking lot, go into the back of the store and go greet my dad. And then when the school day was over, I would walk home from school, often with other children, and then go in the front door of the store, go say hello to Daddy, and then go back home and be with Mother. My mother had a home sewing business all my childhood. I think she began that when we moved to Ashland City, and she was always sewing. unless she was in the kitchen fixing us something to eat. If she was at home, that's what she was doing. From the time I got up in the morning until I went to bed at night, Mother, when she was at home, when we were all at home, then Mother was sewing. Daddy came in and out during the day. He would take breaks and come home. He needed them because he began work every morning at 7 a.m. Monday through Saturday. And Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday he worked till 6 p.m. Wednesday he worked till noon because, like lots of small towns at the time, everything closed, just about the whole town closed down on Wednesday afternoons. Then on Friday night he would work till 7 p.m. and on Saturday night till 9 p.m. So he would come home once or twice during the day for a break. Mother would often fix him a sandwich then, and he also came home for lunch.
And she raked in the big bucks when she was a seamstress, right?
No, she was very, very economical. As I recall, when I was very young, making a custom-made dress, starting with the pattern and fabric that someone would bring to our house. I love to say there was always somebody in a slip in my living room when I was growing up. That's not literally true, but very often there was some lady trying on a dress that Mother had finished, and Mother was fitting it to her perfectly, getting it the exact length she wanted. If the dress needed buttons or thread or zipper and the patron had not brought it, then Mother would maybe send my brother or me up to the dime store, which you could also see from my backyard, and we would get what she needed. Or when we went shopping in Nashville, part of our shopping trip would be going to the fabric department in Harvey's department store and getting whatever Mother needed for one of those dresses. And I think that she charged $3 for a dress when I was very young. That's what I remember. She kept a little notebook with everybody's measurements in it. So it would say Martha, and then it would have her measurements, and then Francis, and it would have her measurements. It was particularly interesting when one of my school teachers would come to my house and be standing in my living room in a slip waiting for Mother to fit a dress to her. That was kind of funny.
My dad worked from 7:30 to 4, and when he came home, he was home. Your dad worked from 7 to 6. What happened when he came home?
Daddy loved to go. He loved Ashland City, and the people of Ashland City loved him, but I can't tell you how many times I heard Daddy say, "Let's just get out of Ashland City." So on Wednesday afternoons, sometimes they would even come and get us out of school to take us to Nashville. That was especially true during the Tennessee State Fair. They might come to school and get us and take us to the fair on Wednesday afternoon. Almost every Monday night, Mother and Daddy went to Nashville shopping. The stores would stay open till 9 o'clock in the downtown area around the corner of 5th Street and Church Street in downtown Nashville. And almost every time they took Steve and me with them. Rarely we would stay with Mrs. Perry, but that was not very often. Usually we went along. We would go to the big department stores, to Harvey's, to Kane Sloan's, to Grant's, to Kastner Knott's, sometimes to the shoe store that was on Church Street.
And, of course, those big department stores aren't there anymore.
No,
right?
None of those are there anymore. We especially enjoyed going to Harvey's because on the top floor there was a merry-go-round and lots of little things to ride. Like a lot of people have seen a little horse that you can put a quarter in. I don't know what you have to put in them now, but you put a quarter in a horse and the child would climb up there and go back and forth on the horse. Well, this place had lots of those kinds of things. Steve and I really enjoyed riding in a little jalopy that knocked us back and forth. And we loved to ride the merry-go-round. I didn't know it at the time, But we used to talk to the man who ran the merry-go-round, and I learned many years later that he was a Jewish Holocaust survivor. And so I'm very grateful that I got to know that precious man. We shopped in the bargain basement of Kane Sloan's, and as I said, in the fabric department at Harvey's. We would buy my brother's jeans and at Grant's, and I don't remember where Mother bought his shirts, but almost all of my clothes Mother made. And of course, we wore nothing but dresses to school until I was a senior in high school. We were required to wear dresses, and Mother made mine. One of my most special memories of being at Harvey's, besides riding the merry-go-round and all of that, is the night we went shopping in the fabric department, and Mother had bought a beautiful piece of blue velvet. She was making me a Christmas dress, and it was in a princess style, and it was so beautiful. I felt like one of the ice skaters I saw on television when I was wearing that dress, because that night at Harvey's, Mother bought a length of real rabbit fur. It came in a long strip, and she sewed that rabbit fur around the neck and on the ends of the sleeves of my beautiful blue velvet Christmas dress. That's a very, very special memory. I also have a very scary memory of Harvey's. One night, Mother and Steve and I were shopping at Harvey's. Steve was 5 years old and I was 8 years old. And we were looking at fabric, Mother and I, and all of a sudden, Steve was nowhere to be found. We searched and searched for Steve. Mother went to officials at the store, and they announced on the loudspeaker that there was a little 5-year-old boy who was lost. And of course, we were beside ourselves. This was at night. And finally, we went outside of Harvey's, and there was my little brother standing on the street corner of Church and 5th Avenue. He was headed to the parking garage. He knew that's where we always went when we got finished shopping, and that's where he was going. It was scary, but we found him, and it was okay. Another special memory of shopping in Nashville was that at the end of our shopping trips, Daddy would find us. He didn't shop with us. He went his own way, and Mother and Steve and I went ours. But he could find us. He was 6'2", and we always marveled at how easily he could find us. We always felt like it was because he could see over things. But when he would find us and it was time for the stores to close, we would walk down 5th Avenue to the Crystal. It was a long, skinny restaurant, and it just had a mirrored wall, an aisle, stools, a counter, and then the long kitchen that was in front of you as you sat on the stools. And we would sit there and watch them make little square crystal hamburgers over and over again. I can just picture it in my mind right now, how they would grill the onions and put the burgers on top of that and then warm the buns on top of that. And we would each get a crystal. That's what we called the hamburgers. And Mother and Daddy would get either coffee. Mother, I think, often got a Sprite, and Steve and I think, got Cokes. And our whole bill was less than $1. We would do that before we went back down to the parking garage. We always shopped downtown, and we always parked in the Life and Casualty Insurance Company's parking lot. You drove your car in. Now, I said a while ago we didn't have a vehicle. We did get one in the late 50s. First, a Plymouth, big old hunker of a Plymouth. It was green. And then around 1963, we got a brand new Ford Falcon with 2 doors. Steve and I got in the same door that Mother and Daddy got in, and the seats pulled forward, just kind of flopped forward, and we would crawl in the back seat. No seat belts, although my parents were forward thinking. When seat belts became a thing, they actually bought some seat belts and put them in that car. Then in the late 60s, they bought a very cool Volkswagen bus, like the hippies were driving, but they never did paint peace signs or anything on ours, I'm glad to say. That's what I learned to drive in. And so those were the cars of my childhood. But back to the parking lot, we would walk down the hill to the Life and Casualty parking lot. And, when we came, Daddy drove in, and we all got out of the car and left the car running. And an attendant would come and get in our car and drive it up into the unknown upper reaches of the parking garage. Then when it was time to go home, we'd walk back down the hill to the parking garage, and an attendant would go over to, I don't know exactly what you call it. It was sort of a vertical conveyor belt, and it had foot rest and handholds. And he would grab on to a handhold, and this thing never stopped moving. So while it moves, he grabbed the handhold and put his feet on the footrest, and he would disappear up into the upper level of the parking garage. And then in a few minutes, our car would come down, and he'd hop out, and we'd hop in, and drive back home to Ashland City, getting there about 10 o'clock at night. Steve and I might have fallen asleep on the way home, and then crawl into bed about 10 o'clock and get up and go to school the next morning. I'd like to say also, we would sing. We had this game we liked to play where he would start a song, and I had to think of a song while he was singing, because there could never be a time that somebody wasn't singing. So if one of us had a hard time thinking of one, then the other one would just have to hold that last note until the other one came up with something. That doesn't sound maybe so peaceful for Mother and Daddy in the front seat that we kept it without ever any silence, but we had fun playing that game.
There was one time when you were at Harvey's that you had a special interest in a popular record.
One Sunday night in 1964, my Aunt Emily, who was just a year and a half older than I, begged my parents to skip church on Sunday night. And it's the only time, well, maybe they might have done that once for me to see The Wizard of Oz. You couldn't just watch any movie anytime you wanted, and The Wizard of Oz would come on, I think, about once a year, and it was always on Sunday night. Mm-hmm. And I do think I saw that as a child. So evidently, they also skipped Sunday night church once or twice for The Wizard of Oz. But on this Sunday night in 1964, when Emily begged Mother and Daddy to let me stay, it was so I could watch the Beatles with her in her bedroom on her own little black and white television. And it was such a surreal experience for this little girl, meaning me, because she sat there and just screamed like the girls on Ed Sullivan. And I just thought, oh me, what in the world is this? But pretty soon I knew that the Beatles were this very important thing that was going on in the world. And so one time when we were at the Harvey's department store, I went to the record department, and I went up to the counter, and I said to the person behind the counter, let me say, stores had lots of employees back then, and you could actually ask people, lots of people, for help. But anyway, I went up to the counter, and I said to the person behind the counter, I'd like to buy that record. and the person behind the counter knew exactly what I wanted. And so I went home that night with I Want to Hold Your Hand by the Beatles.
You mentioned the Life and Casualty Tower. That was the skyscraper in Nashville at the time. If you're familiar with the Nashville skyline now, it is nothing but skyscrapers just all over the place, and more being built all the time. That's a big change. Tell us about your school experience, how that was for you.
I started to school when I was 5, and I didn't turn 6 until the 2nd of December. And so I was very young, and our town had a private kindergarten, but there was no way we could have afforded for me to go to that. So I was a little behind when I started to school. Mother taught me how to write my name, but she taught me how to write it with all capital letters. And being the firstborn that I am, I got to school and the teacher had she had printed our names on little pieces of paper and had them leaning on the chalkboard. But I told her that mine wasn't right because, it was in she had used upper and lowercase letters to write my name. But it took me a little while to catch up. But I did by 3rd grade. I don't think this is a good idea, but at my school, we were divided according to ability. And so in 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade, there were 3 classes. And one of them was the top students, and one of them was the middle students, and one was the lower students. And everybody knew that. Now, I assume maybe that wasn't true at 1st grade, because how would they know unless they put all the ones who'd gone to kindergarten in the same class, maybe. I don't know about that. But by 2nd grade, I was in the middle group. And then by 3rd grade, I was in the top group, and I always stayed in that group the rest of the time. So I enjoyed things like being in the operetta. One year I was a rose, and Mother made me a little pink tutu with crepe paper petals sewn into it and little pink ballet slippers. And when I was in 3rd grade, I got to be a bunny. And our one classmate, Delia, who took dancing lessons, taught us all the most basic tap dance, and we bunnies did the tap dance in that. I was also in an operetta. When I was in 4th or 5th grade, that was a kind of a funny story, because I was always in class with a girl named Charlene. She was named Charlene because her daddy's name was Carl, and I was Charlene because my daddy's name was Charles. And when they called out who got this certain part as a German orphan, Carlene and Charlene both thought they said our name for that part. And so they decided to split the role, and we were twins. So that was, anyway, I enjoyed that sort of thing. I enjoyed playing on the playground. I liked my teachers, and it was a good experience.
Your school, like mine, was racially segregated, right?
That's right. And that's one of the sad things about the 50s and 60s, is that I had very little interaction with African Americans. African Americans shopped at my grandfather's grocery store. One of my mother's sewing customers was African American. But those are the only African Americans I ever remember interacting with, even though between my house and the school was one short street with 4 or 5 houses on it, and all of those families, maybe 3 or 4 houses, all of those families were African Americans. But they didn't go to my school. And I'm embarrassed to say, I don't even know where their school was. There was a school for African American children in elementary school, but there was one high school student who lived on that street, and she was taken to the next county to go to school because we didn't have an African American high school in Cheatham County. So when I heard on television, on the news, that about racial integration of schools, and found out between my 6th grade and 7th grade that our schools were going to be integrated, I was extremely frightened, because what I saw on television was riots, and I feared that it was going to be very dangerous for me to go to school in the 7th grade. But what actually happened was I went to school in the 7th grade. Everything was normal. It was just that there were African American students in my classes too for the first time. It was completely peaceful, and we just had these nice new kids that we could go to school with.
So you had a lot of influences that gave you a sense of security. You had your church, the school, you had large extended family, lots of cousins. How do you think that impacted you as far as your sense of security?
Well, actually, I've been thinking recently about the role of hymns in my life. I think that growing up, being at church as much as I was, that I just heard so much assurance, so many godly teachings, both in the sermons and like Sunday school lessons, but also in what we were singing. I really think it's a powerful tool in the lives of children. I spent a lot of time, even though Mother was sewing, I was often sitting in the same room with her while she was sewing, talking to her, and also spent a lot of time at my grandmother's pink dinette table in her kitchen. My paternal grandmother, Mama Sue, spent a lot of time sitting there. And when other relatives were there and the women would gather around the pink table in Mama Sue's kitchen, I was listening. And I was the oldest of the cousins on both sides. And my brother was next, and he was 3 years younger than I. So while the little kids were playing outside, and there weren't many girls for a long time on my paternal side either. It was all boys. And so I sat at the table and listened to the grown-ups and soaked in what they were talking about, which was good. Even though I did have this great sense of security from my relatives and from church, and from a young age talking to God about my concerns, I also, being a child of the 50s and 60s, had the reality of Russia and the Soviet Union and the atomic bomb. And that was disconcerting as a child. I can remember knowing it would always be necessary for me to stand up for God no matter what. But I remember visualizing a Russian trying to get me to deny God, and the reality of the necessity of that was a scary thing. Yeah. That was a scary thing to think of as a child. What would I do if I really got into that circumstance? And the reality of the atomic weapons was very, very real. We loved going to the state fair, and we had lots of fun, and we rode rides, and we looked at all the exhibits and the animals and everything. But one thing I remember most vividly was the sample fallout shelter at the state fair, and you would go inside and see all these things that people recommended that you keep in your fallout shelter, the place that, and we didn't ever buy a fallout shelter or do any of those things, but it was recommended that you keep water and food and this special place where you could hide if an atomic bomb was ever dropped on you by, of course, nobody else but the Russians. And then you had the reality that if you ever did that and came out of it, you'd enter a devastated world. So that was a difficulty of growing up when we did.
Yeah, you're right. I remember that too. My dad had 1 week of vacation, and he usually used it to work around the house in some way. Your dad had less vacation, and what happened on those times?
Well, as I said, Daddy liked to go. We used to say in our family that somebody's middle name was Go. I think they said that about me too, as I recall, but it was certainly true for Daddy. He got, every year, the big holidays, only Labor Day, 4th of July, Christmas, Thanksgiving Day, New Year's Day. Is that all of them? I think that's all. Your dad probably got only those two back then. And as Ray said, his dad got a week vacation. Daddy got Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday morning, one time a year. He had to be back on Thursday afternoon because that's when the tractor-trailer truck came from the Malone and Hyde grocery wholesale company to bring the groceries that the store would be selling over the next week. And Daddy had to be there to help unload the truck. So, but that didn't stop Daddy. We would get up early on a Sunday morning, very early, take off very early in the morning, which was really important because we always took our vacation in the summer and our car certainly didn't have any air conditioning. So we would take off early in the morning and we would go somewhere, often to the Great Smoky Mountains, but one year we went to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, and saw Fort Sumter. One year we went to Atlanta and to Six Flags over Georgia. We took wonderful vacations. As I've told you, by the time you and I married, I had been to 8 states, and I think with a dad who had that small amount of vacation, that's pretty remarkable. We didn't only travel during that week, though, because we did have Sunday. And even though when we were in Ashland City, which was most of the time, we were at church Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, every night of the gospel meeting, every day of Vacation Bible School. Our lives really centered around the church, which, as I said, was across the street from our house. What special memories I have. I'm so grateful for the Christian training of my mom and dad. It was a sweet church that I never heard them talk about an issue, which I love. We just learned the Gospels. Our preachers mostly talked about Jesus and the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I mean, all the Bible too. We believed in the whole Bible, but the sermons seemed to center on the life and teachings of Jesus, which is just, I think, absolutely wonderful. I had great Sunday school teachers, and so, as I said, we were there every time the doors were open, as we say. But Sometimes we would get up early on a Sunday morning and drive 3 hours to Crossville, Tennessee to see my mother's sister. And as I recall, we were back on Sunday evening for church, which was quite a feat when you consider that 6 hours of that day we were on the road. But Mother and her sister, Nan, were very close, and we would go and visit them. We might, on a Wednesday afternoon or a Sunday afternoon, drive up to Kentucky. We went to Lincoln's birthplace. We went to my old Kentucky home. We would go to the Hermitage. Many Sunday afternoons, Steve and I played on the steps of the Parthenon and mostly in the playground across the street, but we would go into the Parthenon. Daddy never told me history's important. I think you ought to learn it, but he proved how important he thought it was by making sure that we saw lots of historic sites. We went to Fort Nashboro. We took many Sunday afternoon drives through the backwoods of Tennessee. Steve and I used to get so frustrated that we were just driving and driving and driving, and we'd say, "Where are we, Daddy?" And he'd say, "Right here." And but now I'm just so grateful. Sometimes when I'm on a back road in Tennessee, I wonder, did I ever ride on this road with Daddy? And probably a lot of them we did. One other thing I want to say about Sundays, and that is the normal Sunday was go to Sunday school in church, come home and have our one big elaborate meal of the week. Mother was working all the time at her sewing machine, and so we had quick meals for lunch and supper. She often fixed bacon and eggs and toast or biscuits for breakfast. And for lunch, we would usually have potatoes and other vegetables and, as we called it, light bread. That's white bread that's sliced. And then at night, Daddy might bring home a can of chili or a can of tomato soup or something like that. So that's how we ate most of the week. A lot of times on Friday night, she would make hamburgers and her absolutely amazing homemade French fries, or maybe spaghetti or something like that. Friday night, the meals were sometimes special. I think often special on Friday night. But Sunday, it was fried chicken, meatloaf, or something like that. And after that, and her homemade chess pies and chocolate meringue pie too. But after that lunch, we would usually drive to Springfield and see Granny and Granddaddy, who were Mother's mom and dad. And then we would come back to my grandparents' house, my paternal grandparents' house, Mama Sue and Daddy Leland, and spend some time with them. Often there'd be cousins there, my aunt and uncle, and always my youngest aunt, because she was just a year and a half older than I. I spent a lot of time at my paternal grandparents' house because I would go and play or spend the night with my Aunt Emily, who was more like a sister. And then after a little time at Mama Sue's and Daddy Leland's, we'd be back in Ashland City for Sunday night church.
Well, thank you so much for sharing these memories. I'm Ray Notgrass. Thank you for exploring history with us today.
This has been Exploring History with Ray Notgrass, a production of Notgrass History. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast in your favorite podcast app, and please leave a rating and review so that we can reach more people with our episodes. If you want to learn about new homeschool resources and opportunities from Notgrass History, you can sign up for our email newsletter at exploringhistorypodcast.com. This program was produced by me, Titus Anderson. Thanks for listening.